I am Herman Wigodsky, W-I-G-O-D-S-K-Y.
Okay, thank you. 50 years ago from now, when people pick this up, they'll wonder what this is all about.
I have an MD degree and a PhD in physiology, both earned at Northwestern University.
Thank you. So we were talking about Hugo Black and was it your friend Outerbach?
No, Offerdorfer.
Overdorfer.
Lewis Oberdorfer.
Yeah.
Well, when Lewis finished at Harvard, he was a brilliant law student. His father was influential in getting Black to take him on as one of his interns, clerks.
Right.
And in 1947, I resigned from the Air Forces and moved to Washington. And my resignation came about because of my experiences during World War II and before, because my experiences with the Nazis really went back to the Spanish Revolution. I had a cousin who was in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, a group of young men who went from the United States to fight in Spain. He was killed in his first battle. Of course, I was intrigued, but I was very taken up with the idea of having a real democracy in Spain. I was not wise enough in those days to recognize what an influence the communists were in all this business, but it didn't make any difference. The right wing in Spain was, as far as I was concerned, was horrible and cozied up to the Nazis. And what most people don't realize is that if you were a foreigner and you were captured, you were sent to Germany and interned in Dachau, being one of the places where they were interned. I'm sorry that I don't know enough about what happened to those people. But then I went to Northwestern in 1937 and actually stood on the corner of State and Madison in Chicago collecting money for the Spanish Republic. And my boss, Dr. A.C. Ivey, was an internationally known physiologist. And a very ardent patriot and very much opposed to what had been going on in Germany. So we saw eye to eye about most everything. And the reason I tell you this is because he shows up later on in the story.
Oh, great. This is fabulous. Keep going. Maybe this just continue on the process.
But when I went in the military, well, I'll tell you a story about A.C. Ivey. If you ever worked for him, you worked for him the rest of your life. He never asked any questions. He could have not seen you for 10 years. He'd call up and say, Wigodsky, I wish you'd do so and so and so and so and so, and hang up. And he didn't wait for you to answer. He just knew you were going to do it. And I was an intern in 1941, in 1940 and 41, at the Evanston Hospital. And they called one day to say, typically, Wigodsky, I talked yesterday with a Colonel Armstrong in the Air Forces who's looking for somebody in physiology to come down to the School of Aviation Medicine in San Antonio to start a physiology department. And you and Andrews have been fooling around here in the department with some of that stuff, and I thought that you ought to talk to him. And so I made an appointment for you to go and see him tomorrow noon.
Bingo.
Bingo, that's right. I went to see, he was then Major Armstrong, who was the most literate of anybody in medical sciences in aviation. He had written a book which was used all over the world. And he and I saw eye to eye right bang off. In 3 minutes, he said, well, I want you to come down to San Antonio and I'll fix it up. I said, well, I've got orders and I'm not in the Air Forces. I'm assigned to ground forces. He said, don't worry about that. I'll get that fixed. I'll see that the secretary changes your orders. And that pleased me no end. I was an ardent militarist because of my boss, Dr. Ivey, who came back from Russia in 1938. He'd been to an international meeting and said, well, all you young fellas better join the reserves because there's going to be a great war in Europe, and Russia, France, England are going to be allies, and we'll get into it probably. And if you don't get some training and know what you're doing, you're going to be taken in just as soldiers. And you want to do that, and I don't want you to do that. And I took him literally, and I joined the reserves across the street, and I'd been on maneuvers for 2 years, in the summertime for a month, which is another long story. But so, having had a little bit of military background, and Dr. Andrews had the owner of the Chicago Tribune as a patient. And he had complained at one time that he felt much better in the summertime than he did in the wintertime. He suffered from very bad sinusitis. And Andy took a little history and talked to him in addition to his examination and said, well, I can see what the reason is. In the summertime, you leave Chicago Friday afternoon in your airplane and you fly up to Wisconsin, where your summer home is. And then on Sunday night or Monday morning, you fly back to Chicago. And that difference in altitude causes you to empty out your sinuses, promotes drainage of the sinuses. And so you feel better in the summertime than in the wintertime when you don't do any flying, or not much flying. Well, with that background, Andrews was able to get the man from the Chicago Tribune to give us some money in the department to do a little study. And we bought a little tank, just big enough for the two of us to sit in, and with our knees drawn right up to our chin. So we were just curved like that, just follow the curvature of this thing. Well, we did some experiments, mostly on ourselves. And so we did have some background, and it was something that there weren't very many other people in physiology that were very much interested. There had been a small group who had gone down to Chile in the early 30s, English and Americans, and they'd gone to Volcan Aconcagua in Chile, which is 21,000 feet above sea level. And they worked first at sea level and then up to the altitude. You could get to 21,000 feet regularly. And sure enough, General Armstrong got my orders changed, and I started out with my old orders in Enid, Oklahoma, where the place was just being built. And there were 5 doctors. One was the chief of the medical service, one was the public health officer, one was a laboratory officer, one was doing something else, and I had 150 beds, no nurses, and wondered what had happened to my orders. At Christmas time, the sergeant major caught me in the hall and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, what do you mean?" He said, "You're supposed to be down at Randolph Field." And I said, well, I thought I was, but I haven't seen any orders. Oh, he said, the chief has had your orders for 2 weeks now. So I went tearing into his office, and sure enough, he had my orders. And he said, well, he said, you're doing such a good job, and I like you. I didn't want you to go down there. I want you to stay here.
Oh, nice.
So I just packed up bag and baggage and arrived in San Antonio the 1st of January of 1942. And started with that physiology department and was setting up experiments. Harry Armstrong was busy enlarging this little nucleus of people who had been struggling there since 1932, trying to introduce a semblance of some sort of science into military medicine as it applied to aviation. Shortly thereafter, a group came down from Washington, the air surgeon, and the air surgeon of the British Air Force, and a liaison fellow by the name of Percy Lee, who became a lifelong friend, and a civilian, Dr. Detlef W. Bronk. He was the chief of the Edward Johnson Foundation at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was really a biophysicist as much as he was a physiologist, and ran a splendid laboratory with excellent people, and had been an aviator in World War I, Navy aviator in World War I, a couple days a week.
What was your role there?
Well, my role was to set up the operations of the aviation physiologists nationally and internationally, it turned out, and to supervise. I didn't, but Colonel Griffiths was responsible for supervising the research at the School of Aviation Medicine in San Antonio and at the physiology labs at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, and wherever else they were going to be set up, because eventually we set up a whole network. Griffiths did not do much about the aviation physiology thing. With Dr. Bronk, pretty much had responsibility for that. But then...
how'd you find your way ultimately from Washington to when you get your orders to go to Germany?
Well, I didn't go to Germany. Dr. Bronk, as we approached the invasion of Europe, would discuss time after time with the air surgeon the possibility of his going to Europe, following the troops, visiting with the scientists that he knew in Europe as they were liberated, in order to get some idea as what they might know about what was going on in Germany. The other activity I had, which was not a real assignment, but which worked out to be a great deal of fun for me. The first week that I was in Washington, we were over in a World War I building at the northwest end of the Washington Airport. And the Signal Corps came to the air surgeon saying that fighter pilots were complaining that they could not see the panels that ground troops displayed to indicate the front line, so that they could strafe and do whatever they had to do to assist them. And that they were having a bad time, and they wondered if there was something that they could do or could be done or what have you to solve that problem of getting something that they could see. The air surgeon asked me if, he said, well, this looks like a question in vision physiology. You need to take a look at it, which I did. And I had a friend in New York who was a wonderful vision physiologist, and whose great claim to fame was when the New York City suddenly changed their traffic light system. Colorblind people couldn't distinguish the red and the green. And he devised a color scheme of lights and filters and things that was easily put on these traffic lights so that colorblind people that we had hung the moon, because they really were in a bad way. Somehow or another, the intelligence people, the chief of the intelligence division, was talking to somebody in this signal corps, and he told them about me and that the panel business. And I don't know why they were discussing it, but suddenly I got a call from the intelligence to come and see them, which I did. And they had some problems that were problems in medical research, basically, that had come to their attention, and there were things that they wanted to investigate. And so I just accidentally established a liaison with them, and they thought enough of me, so they would send me all these secret things that came to them that had to do with medicine or physiology or whatever they thought. And in the course of that, they began to send me stuff that was coming out of Germany. And that was my first contact, direct contact with that, and it was pretty miserable and just terrible. One of the earliest things that I got was an experiment that the Nazis had done in Berchtesgaden, where they took a group of 20 or 30 people, I can't remember exactly the number now, of different ages, and staked them out naked in the snow in the mountains there in Berchtesgaden, and went around every hour to see who was alive and who was dead, and if they were partially alive, they would take them and then investigate ways of resuscitating them. And that their excuse for doing that was that they had, particularly in the North Sea, for example, had sailors being dumped in this cold water and being exposed to very, very low temperatures where they didn't survive very long. And one of the experiments that they did that stood out in my mind was they rescued a man in his middle 30s, as I recall, and they put him to bed between two whores with hopes that that stimulus might assist in the man's revival. They took people and threw them into pools of water that had cakes of ice floating in them to see how long they'd survive. In the Berchtesgaden thing, they had tiny infants to very old people. They had a whole range of ages. Well,
how would this come to you? In reports? Would they
yeah. Yes, intelligence reports.
Right.
questions coming from the field or observations being made in the field that people thought were important enough to send back to Washington.
Now, what time frame would this have been when you were starting to get these reports?
They started coming in late 42, early 43.
So during the war, I mean, you had.
Oh yeah, yes. Which tied to this thing that Bronk wanted to do about going and seeing if the scientists that he knew a number of Nobel Prize winners and chiefs of this and that all over Europe. He'd gotten his PhD at Cambridge with a man who later got a Nobel Prize. And he and that man did a very significant study on the auditory nerve of the cat, demonstrating that it was an electrical impulse by taking a single fiber of that nerve fiber and putting a microphone on one end and a speaker at the other end, and having that speaking in the microphone have that impulse travel along, demonstrated that it was an electrical impulse.
So your boss, in essence, wanted to go in during, like, even D-Day, right after D-Day.
You got it. And so when D-Day came around, Bronk was hopping around first on one foot and then the other. We had to go. And finally the air surgeon spoke to General Arnold about it, and General Arnold okayed it. We could go. And so I really went as Bronk's amanuensis, as it were, because I knew the military ropes, and being a physiologist and having worked with them on this other thing, we made a good natural pair. We went first to England, and we should have gone home that first day. The English, very wisely, were picking up scientists as they were freed from their country,
right,
and picking them up and bringing them to England. And they had established a society of visiting scientists and let these guys visit with scientists in England to find out what had been going on during the war when they'd been shut away from all of this stuff.
Right.
And we had the sense that something had gone on that interrupted their contact with the Germans. And it wasn't really until later on when we got to Paris very shortly after Paris was liberated. And Bronk had a good friend there. We went to visit him first thing. He was the chief of physiology at the Sorbonne. Very fine job.
Yep.
And I can still hear him say, "Oh, Bronk, you don't want to do that. Ever after the 1st of September in '39, when the Nazis went to Poland," he said, "none of us had anything to do with the Germans." And that was pretty much the truth. If I digress, you have to tell me.
No,
But in the course of traveling around in Europe, we got to Brussels the day after Brussels was liberated. Well, we were in Paris shortly after Paris had been liberated. I can't remember the exact time, but it was very shortly. And then we moved around. We went to Nancy one time, and we went up on the English Channel border one time, and we moved around meeting people. One of the first persons that we went to see was Madame Joliot-Curie and her husband. And that was very interesting seeing them because they were a part of the royalty of medical research in Europe. And it turned out that visit was one of the biggest flops that we encountered because all they wanted to talk about was les bombes, les bombes. They had, for a long period of time, more than a year, had established a place in the basement of the city hall on the island in the Seine in which they were making bombs. And they never knew whether or not the bombs worked. But as the Germans were getting ready to leave Paris, they turned these bombs over to the Marquis, who used them, and they worked, and they were just, it was to them the greatest thing that had happened. It was really funny.
Madame Curie, my gosh.
No, it was Madame Curie's daughter and her husband.
Now, from there, did you find your way to Germany at all, or were you just...
No, we didn't get to Germany. We got to Brussels the day after Brussels was liberated.
Right.
And that was an experience. The British had taken over what was the Belgian military hospital in Brussels, and the Germans had occupied it, so it was full of Germans, a complete medical staff, all that sort of thing. So Dutton and I trotted out there one day to see what was going on, what they were doing, what they knew, and there was an English major who was in charge. He was glad to see us, treated us very nicely, and his opinion of Nazi soldiers was just the lowest scum of the earth.
Right.
We interviewed the fellow who had been the head of the hospital, and to test him, I asked him whether or not they had sufficient tetanus vaccine to immunize all the soldiers like we did, because everybody in our army got vaccinated for tetanus. Oh, of course, I did all sorts of stuff. Well, I happen to know from my intelligence stuff that for like a year or year and a half before the time that I saw this guy, that they had resorted to inoculating with saltwater solution because they couldn't make enough tetanus vaccine. And so these guys all went off to war thinking that they'd been immunized, and they hadn't been. Well, Bronk and I had interviewed a bunch of captured German physicians and nurses in England, a big bunch, and found out from the very beginning that they lied. They did not tell the truth. It was so irritating to have them tell you something that you knew was not true, and you could lead them around by the nose in the hopes they would break someplace. Or
Right.
no, they just didn't tell the truth. Well,
After the war, were you continuing to get information and were analyzing this?
well, yes, because now, during the time that I was in the Pentagon, my boss at Northwestern became the chief of research for the Naval Medical Research Establishment in Bethesda.
Mm-hmm.
He was a civilian chief, and knowing him and his habits, I knew that what he would do was he would just simply set up a bed in the laboratory, and that would be where he lived. He'd live and work and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's exactly what he did. So I used to go out there once or twice a week and take him to dinner, and then we'd go bowling, or we'd go to a movie, or we'd do anything for me to get him out of that laboratory. When I started to get the stuff about the Germans, which, sort of super secret stuff, I did what I should not have done, but I did it anyway, because I wanted him to know about it, because he was getting no information through the Navy.
Right.
He didn't know what the hell was going on. He was doing research, And the Navy's attitude towards doctors was very bad anyway. Regardless of your rank in the Navy, if you were a doctor, you sat below the salt at the table. And here was this guy, you know, who was an idol so far as I was concerned. Well, we would talk about all this stuff, and we talked a great deal about what was coming through on aviation medical research and on basic research like the freezing experiments and that sort of stuff. When they were setting up for he went back to Chicago, back to his job at Northwestern, and when they were setting up to do the background work for the doctors in Germany in preparation for the Nuremberg trials, the American Medical Association nominated Dr. Ivey as a physician to represent the United States in that group. Okay. And so that, he was the source of a lot of stuff from then on, because one of the things he did was he very carefully collected biographies and background material on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of doctors, some that were known to participate in these experiments, some who were in universities doing research, and some who were in the armed forces. And so he had vast amounts of material, and one of the things he was supposed to do was to identify individuals who ought to be tried. And it was a big job, and since I was the one who had given him the information in the beginning, he thought that I would be a good one to help him. So he asked me if I could help. And by this time, I had gone back to the School of Aviation Medicine as the chief of research down there. And so I was privileged to see all these things that he was working on and to see some of the identification. He went off to the trials. They tried 27 doctors in that first trial, because that were all the seats that there were in the dock, were 27 seats. Mm-hmm. There were dozens and dozens of people that he and I knew were never going to get to the trials, and that happened. I, in my ardor for the military, had taken the examinations in 1942 for regular Air Force appointment. In those days you had to take a week-long set of exams, and I did it, and I got in. So when I returned to Randolph Field, one of my people from the aviation physiology group took my place in Washington, and he called me when the end of the war came, and he said, "Wig, you're not gonna believe, but the man who had taken Colonel Griffith's place had come in his office the day before and said, 'Nick, let's start closing down all this research. We don't want the end of the war to come and us still doing research.'" And Nick could not convince him that what they ought to start doing now was in preparation for the changes that were coming about in aviation and what they could happen in the future and future wars and future developments. Sure. He was so upset. Well, anyway.
So Dr. Ivey, did he go to Nuremberg then?
Oh, yes. He was the principal doctor, United States doctor at the trials. The other fellow was a psychiatrist from Boston who, in comparison to Ivey, did not do much. Ivey was the leading one in identifying people.
You had no reason to go. You didn't go to Nuremberg, did you?
No.
You just had access to his records and helped.
Conversations with him. Whenever he was back in Chicago, he'd call, and if I could, I'd go up there. He would send me stuff in the mail and send stuff by courier. It worked out well, but it enabled me to get a good panoramic view of the people in Nazi Germany, doctors and physiologists and people in universities, and who were doing research, and what they had done, how they had done it, identified them by name, and all sorts of information about them.
Were they discouraged that they couldn't get Mengele? Was he a known commodity at the time?
Not to my knowledge.
Right.
Mengele, I didn't learn about except later on when he appeared, when his name appeared, came up in newspapers and stuff. But there was a young, aggressive lieutenant colonel, got stationed in Wiesbaden, and he got cozy with Germans.
So you got cozy with the Germans.
And he tried to get the air surgeon to let him identify German medical scientists or physiologists or related sciences and bring them to the United States. The idea being that if we didn't take advantage of them, Braun was a part of that whole general problem. Nobody consulted me, for example, in my position as chief of research at the School of Aviation Medicine. And the idea was that if we didn't take them, they'd go to Russia. And my attitude was, give them to them. Pack the suitcases for them, whatever we do. Don't take them, send them to Russia. They'll confuse the Russians. What they've accomplished has been zilch. Well, this guy was so impressed with it. And he was particularly impressed with a guy by the name of Hubertus Strughold. And Hubertus Strughold was not at the top of Dr. Ivey's in my list, but he was certainly one that we would like to have seen tried. But this young guy was able to exert enough pressure, and Strughold, being the sort of bastard that he was in terms of being able to, get into good graces and all that sort of stuff, he was all hot for coming to the United States. He thought that was a great idea. And so this young fella said, well, Strughold denies having done anything that was wrong and a whole bunch of other such stuff, and sold the air staff on the idea of bringing those people to the United States. And suddenly, in December of 1946, early December, the week after Thanksgiving, I got a letter informing me that we would receive soon 20 German scientists to come to be on the staff at the School of Aviation Medicine. And I was sick. In those 20 people were 5 people whom I knew from my work with Ivey should have been in the Nuremberg trials. And lo and behold, Hubertus Strughold was one of them. Well, I was sick at heart with all the stuff that I'd seen in Europe and all this background material you and I have been discussing. I just couldn't I couldn't stomach the idea, and particularly since we had the most wonderful research staff at the school at that time. Just, well, to give you an idea, the fellow who was the chief of psychiatry and who worked on how to identify people's abilities in terms of would they make good gunners or bombardiers or all that sort of stuff. They separated out people and told you what your bets were, that if he was in this group, that 3 out of 5 of them would survive the training and would get into active service and all that sort of stuff. He later became the president of the American Psychological Association. The library of the American Psychological Association is named after him. And it was that quality of guy. There were 156 psychologists whom I knew, and in that bunch, 60 out of them were chairmen of departments within a year after they left the military. These were really very high-class guys. So I get in the plane, go up to Washington, and tell them, Nick's coming out. Oh no. They knew that I would object. And they've been looking at my record. And I had not had enough overseas service. So what they were going to do, they were going to relieve me of my duties as the chief of research, and they were going to send me to Hangzhou, China, to start a school of aviation medicine for the Chinese Air Forces. I said, you guys got to be out of your mind. The Chinese Air Force is going to be blown out of the tub. The communists are going to take over that country. Oh, you always talk dirty, and you always talk nasty, and you always know better than everybody else. And I said, okay, but don't send them to me. The people that I have want to get out of uniform and stay with us as civilians. And you're looking at a group of the most qualified scientists in the United States. And if we don't do something, they're going to go back to civilian life and go back to their universities, and we're going to lose them forever, because once they're away from the school, they will not have, they're not going to carry with them this drive to do the kind of research that we're interested in. No, that up in Washington before the first of the year, and by this time, that young guy who'd been in Wiesbaden was now in the Air Surgeon's office in Washington. And so I left the service. Went to the Civil Aeronautics Administration as a chief of the Physical Standards Division, and that's a whole other story. But
one question I have, my uncle was a physician in the Navy and ended up in Bethesda during the war, right after the war, named Philip Carlson. Does the name Phil Carlson mean anything to you? Would your paths have crossed?
Philip Carlson.
He was at Bethesda, the Navy.
No, it didn't.
There were lots of
I knew, the people I knew best were a couple of guys in the...
Now, you did, when we talked a little bit the other day after Richard Sonnenfeld's lecture, you mentioned the fact that through Hugo Black's clerk,
Yep.
friend of yours, you'd actually seen Jackson. Talk a little bit about that.
I really don't have much to talk about. That's why I say I don't want to mislead you. It was a sort of a courtesy situation of this is Dr. Wigodsky, Justice Black, and he's, you know, in the Civil Aeronautics Administration and what it had been doing and that sort of stuff, and that was about it. It was.
How did you had a relationship with, was the guy's name was, who was the clerk's name?
Overdorfer.
Overdorfer.
Yeah.
You knew him.
Oh yeah, I'd known him for quite some time.
How did you know him?
He married a girl from Montgomery, Alabama, and a very dear friend of ours from San Antonio married his wife's sister. And I met Lewis before that in Washington, when he left the Supreme Court, he went to work for a firm headed by a man who had rewritten the income tax code in 1942 or 43. And I was in Washington then at the National Academy of Sciences. Oh, I forgot to tell you about that. I only stayed with the Civil Aeronautics Administration for a few months, from March of 47 till the 1st of September of 47. I had a great time doing what I did, though. And then they couldn't understand I'd gotten to the equivalent of a 15 in rank in the civil service the days that I handed in my resignation. They just couldn't believe it. But what had happened was my friend Bronk had become the president of the National Research Council. I didn't tell him that I was in Washington, because I knew what would happen, and sure enough it happened. He found out I was in Washington. He came banging on the telephone, and he was putting together a committee on atomic casualties, and he wanted me to come and be the professional associate. And so I left the aeronautics group and went to the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, as the professional associate for the Committee on Atomic Casualties, and built the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in Japan. That wasn't a whole another story. But back to my friend Oberdorfer.
Who's still alive, I understand.
Oh yeah, he is. He made a deal with this guy in that office that they would teach him tax law, about which he knew only what he'd learned in law school. And he would do general law for the clients who came to Washington and had general law business to do while they were involved in whatever it was that they were doing in Washington, whether it was, hearings before this or that committee or justice or whatever. After 2 years, the chief called him in and said, "Lewis, we've got to do something about you. You're making more money than the junior partners. And we just can't have that happen. You certainly will get a partnership, a junior partnership, but we can't have you as, just more than a clerk here,
Yeah.
Making more money than the junior partners." And Lewis couldn't disabuse him of the idea, and so he left and went with a fellow set up on Connecticut Avenue, and in Bing Swing they had practice. What the guy didn't realize was how Lewis got to go to the Supreme Court because of Justice Black and a relationship with Lewis's father. He didn't realize how strong it was. I mean, Lewis had a very successful career as a lawyer in Washington, and then, gee, I don't know how many years ago now it is, but he had had enough. He was appointed a justice in the federal courts in the District of Columbia.